now currently working in the Department of Health at a community health centre, which he's going to tell you something about, in Queen's Park. And he has an interest in teenage pregnancy and has written about it, and will also tell you that the seeds of teenage pregnancy in some teenagers at any rate may be sown there at the time of birth, and therefore I think there is a very important message in that, and one which we who work in this hospital.
Right. Thank you very much, Harry. I guess this brings back memories coming to talk to you here today, because I won't tell you how many years ago it was that I was here, but it has more than work associations. In the early hours of one morning, I was with a nurse engaged in, I'm going to be careful with my words, we were doing exchange transfusion, and from there stemmed a relationship which led to our marriage, and we've had 2 of our children here, so it has more than work associations, this place. And maybe it's not such a coincidence that when I worked here, also I won't tell me how many years ago, but I might give you a clue, that some of the neonates I was working with are now reaching teenage. And so perhaps it's not ironic that I'm talking to you today about preventing teenage suicide from birth. But just to give a background to how I get involved in this area, as Harry said, I'm a community child health medical officer, and I guess it's a chance to tell you what that means, because I'd never even heard of such a position when I worked here as a paediatric registrar. And basically what it means is I see referrals from community, school and child health nurses, mainly child health nurses in fact, so I'm mainly dealing with preschoolers. And they refer things for hearing tests and undescended test tubes that they're worried about, things like that, and various aspects of the new morbidity, developmental stage. And one of the things we have to do is go to the schools and check for scoliosis, or at least the community nurses check for scoliosis, and then I go and assess them and see whether they need referring on or not. And it was whilst doing this that I wondered, here we are screening for a disease which isn't lethal and in fact has a lesser incidence than that of suicide in teenagers. Teenage suicide being the second commonest cause of death. So I thought, well, how about screening for potential suicide, number one, and seeing as depression as a precursor of suicide, also we thought. He suggested using the Beck Depression Inventory. And so the proposal was that I would use it in 3 high schools in Year 10 students. But to do that I had to get permission from the Education Department. And that permission was denied, saying that it would cause too much community anxiety. So I had to think again. And my further reading suggested that the way to go was to alert all those in contact with young people as to the warning signs. And around about that time, Suzanne Fabian was coming over here for the National Association of Loss and Grief Conference. And so it seemed like a great opportunity to use her expertise to heighten this awareness of the problem and the fact that there are things you can pick up to prevent it happening. And because of the bureaucratic red tape, I thought it would probably be impossible to try and organise it as a public servant. So I did it as chairman of the Australian Association for Adolescent Health. And we were absolutely overwhelmed by the response to this conference that we put on. We only had about 320 seats, yet we managed to squeeze in an extra 100 or so people up and down the aisles and round the front. And because of that overwhelming response, and because of a number of good suggestions were made on that night, not only from Suzanne Fabian, but also from the audience, we felt we couldn't just leave it there, that we had to do something about it. So the Youth Suicide Prevention Task Force was convened to try and implement some of those recommendations. And I guess cutting a long story short, with our lobbying, seeing ministers and various things like that, a ministerial working party was set up called the Youth Suicide Working Party. And it's probably worth pointing out there's a difference there, therefore, between the Youth Suicide Prevention Task Force, which is just a small group of volunteers, a sort of lobby group, to the Youth Suicide Working Party, which is under the chairmanship of Assistant Commissioner Mike Dahl. And the Working Party was set up in September, the report was finished in December. It was a remarkably fast report, and Nothing has happened since then, however, after the election. But we are reassured that it will start happening. So, how big a problem is it? Should we really be concerned about it? And this, you might not be able to see it exactly, all the details here, but basically here's Australia, crosshatch. And you can see there's been a gradual increase over the last few years. I think it started in 1970, 70 to 85, and that's males 15 to 29 years. Females stay roughly the same. Whereas in other countries like Japan, and most of us hear about the increasing rate in Japan, in fact it's not increasing, it's decreasing. And in America it's roughly stayed the same over the last few years. So it seems to be Australia is different from the rest of the world. You can see it more clearly there. And there's been a dramatic increase, particularly in the, not in fact teenagers, but 19 to 24 age range. So that's the whole of Australia. And basically what it means is that there's, whilst we're sitting here today, there's probably one young person who has committed suicide somewhere in Australia. And it's not sort of peculiar to the whole of Australia, it certainly has been a problem in Western Australia. And up to about 86 there were less than 10 suicides a year. Already this year we've passed that total. So what are we going to do about it? Well, obviously the thing to do is to treat the cause, as we're told in medical school. No point treating the symptoms. And as you gather from my introduction, I'm not an expert on the subject. So if you're not an expert, what do? You look it up in the literature. And this is a direct quote from 1987's Medical Journal of Australia, which says, "The causes of suicidal behaviour in young persons remains enigmatic, and so too do the appropriate measures to combat it." So it wasn't terribly helpful going to the expert literature. So in that case, one has to sort of formulate one's own opinion. And if there has been a change, an increase in suicide over the last few decades, then surely one should look at what's happening in society over the last few decades. So in 3 minutes I'm going to tell you what's the history of the world. In the 50s, post-war baby boom, babies were born with silver spoons in their mouths. In other words, they had all their basic needs met. And when basic needs are met, Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory comes in, that you go on to self-actualization, which some may disagree happened in the 60s, but certainly young people at that time probably felt they were the need generation. And if it feels good, do it, was their motto. So it did feel good and they did it. And they ended up probably having quite a few unwanted children. And they didn't have the support from the families because they didn't have the values of the older generation anymore. They've been chucked out the window. Extended family was starting to disappear at that stage. So with that background, this generation gave birth to teenagers of today who feel alienated in today's society. They're inconvenient in a convenient society. That's one thing children are not, is convenient, and yet everything else is convenient. We've got dishwashers and washing machines and everything's fast foods, everything's easy, theoretically. And then there's technological change which is going faster in education. They're maturing earlier than they did, and yet their emotional maturity hasn't kept pace with that. They're overstimulated by TV but underinformed, and they've got environmental threats to worry about. So no wonder they get angry, and they can take that anger out on themselves, or on society, turn to crime, or they can just blot it out with substance abuse. So another way of looking at it is to look at the here and now. We have the worries of the world on the shoulders of the young people that are supposed to be represented around there, which potentiates this cycle of family to youth. Family used to be a buffer against stress, is now often the source of stress. So it just potentiates this cycle. And because all that focuses on young people, children, so they exhibit protest behaviour, or they get kicked out of home because that's the flavour of the month at the moment. So what do we do about it? Well, build more houses, We have drug offensive campaigns, buy them all the condoms, build more jails, build more psychiatric institutions, and of course after you don't have to do anything at all. Who agrees with that? That's good. When I was discussing the situation with a Year 12 student the other day, he said, yeah, the general feeling is we're the last generation. And it's understandable when you look at all this, and because they're going to have to face the worries about environmental issues in the next couple of weeks with World Environment Day next week. And I'd just like to read you a poem by a Year 12 student in a school in my area. And incidentally, this is from the high school news, and they just started and they wanted anything and anything, just any sort of contribution. I couldn't believe that. I just had to phone them up. And did you ask for things that worry you and depress you? No, we just want anything. And here's some titles of some other ones here. Dying from inside, going, gone, endless night, and this one, growing up. Why is it the older I grow, the more fantasy fades and cold, hard reality hits? Fairy tales end in divorce, hidden meanings become known, the world loses its magic, and the future looms overhead, menacing. Time moves on, aging me more each day. Now I become cynical, so by the time I'm old enough to know and do what's right, I no longer care. Putting it rather more strongly is this note written by a 15-year-old before he committed suicide. I wish I'd die soon. This world's fucked. It shits me. I just want to die and be forgotten. I wish I had the button from the atomic bomb. I'd push it. That was taken from this document by Richard Eckersley, Casualties of Change, Commission for the Future report, which rather well sums it up, I think, in this newspaper report. I don't expect you to read it all. I'll just summarise it by reading the first and last paragraphs. The shock and change and the destruction of traditional lifestyles and views are leading to high levels of apathy, suicide, drug abuse and crime among Australia's youth. The speed of change, the scale and power of the technologies we are developing, and the complexities of our social systems demand that the key components of our society, family, school, workplace, government, function at a higher level of efficiency than was required in the past. Yet in many respects, the performance of these institutions is not only not getting better, it's getting worse. I certainly recommend that you read this report, and you can purchase it at the government bookstore. And it really sums up the situation that young people have to face today. But perhaps bring it down to earth a bit. This study here in Sydney shows that poor family lives make high school students turn to drink, drugs and early sex. They concluded in this report that poor family relationships have serious implications for the lives of adolescents, and that the promotion of good family relationships should become a major goal of our society. If possible, help should be provided before health-threatening behaviours are developed, before the family relationships are damaged severely, and before suicide attempts are made. Whenever I indicate there that family is the answer, I always like to quote Margaret Mead, who said, "We now expect the family to achieve alone what no other society ever expected an individual family to accomplish unaided. In effect, we call upon the individual family to have to do what the whole clan used to do." So what we need is a surrogate clan system. Now, I quoted before that from the Australian literature to say that we really don't know what the cause is, but based on American literature, there's quite a number of proven fundamental causes. And of course, again, family comes out number one. Conflict within the family, a punitive family, if there's been a suicide in the family, psychiatric illness or death, abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, substance abuse, on the yak factor, and by that I mean communication. This is probably the most important, because if you think about it, it's very difficult to communicate with those nearest and dearest to you if your parents are too busy, too drunk, abusive, not there. Depression, and by that I mean, I guess in its layman's term, as well as clinically depression, another psychiatric illness should be included there. But I try not to put that up when talking to, say, lay audiences, because they generally go away and say, oh, they're all mad. And of course, as I should indicate later, that's not true. But certainly, psychiatric conditions need to be ruled out when you identify a young person at risk. 3/4 of those who finally do succeed in suicide will have attempted or threatened to do so beforehand. Unemployment is known to be a factor. As we know from the Muirhead inquiry, incarceration is a significant factor, and learning disability is an overrepresented condition in those at suicide. Some say as high as 50%. Perhaps just to summarise, from the World Health Organization Health of Youth report dated March 1989, so it's very recent, in the majority of young people that commit suicide, there is no diagnosable mental disorder, and personal social factors play the major role, which tends to go against some other papers that say that in 95% of cases there's a diagnosable DSM-3 criteria psychiatric disorder. But obviously, as it's relevant to this department, you probably need to know what I mean by birth trauma. And I'll read direct from the report, which is in the Lancet, March 1985, entitled The Relationship of Maternal and Perinatal Conditions to Eventual Adolescent Suicide. And it was written by Lee Salk and others at the Department of Psychiatry, Cornell University, Rhode Island, USA. And in their introduction they say, while the suicide rate has risen over the last 30 years, perinatal mortality has fallen. Many infants who previously would not have survived the first 30 days of life now do so as a result of aggressive efforts at resuscitation. The present study was undertaken to determine whether adolescents who commit suicide may have experienced adversities in the perinatal period due to maternal or birth conditions. To examine this hypothesis, we conducted a blind review of the birth records of 52 infants who subsequently committed suicide and 2 matched control groups. And in the results they say that when the frequency of occurrence of the 46 maternal, prenatal, birth and neonatal risk factors for each suicide victim was compared with that of each matched control, a statistically significant difference was found. Of 10 maternal and perinatal risk factors, they were 4 times as common in the perinatal histories of the suicide victims as those in the control group 1, and 3 times as common as in control group 2. The statistical differences between the suicide victims and each of the control groups is significant, p less than 0.005. The statistical difference between the 2 controls is not significant. We also compared the 3 groups with respect to the 3 risk factors most commonly found among the suicide victims. These are respiratory distress for more than 1 hour at birth, no antenatal care before 20 weeks, and chronic disease of the mother during pregnancy. The 3 risk factors combined differentiate the suicide victims from each of the matched control groups considerably better than any one of the 3 risk factors taken separately. To determine the independence of each factor in distinguishing the suicide victims from the matched controls, we examined the degree to which each risk factor occurred independently or together with either or both of the other 2 risk factors. These risk factors occurred alone in 81% of the suicide cases, in combination with one other factor in 90%, and in combination with both other factors in none, indicating that these variables operate independently of one another in distinguishing suicide victims from their matched controls. This supports the validity of the statistical differences between the suicide group and each of the matched controls. And in their discussion, they say, the findings of this study provide evidence that perinatal experiences influence the risk of suicide in adolescents. Many babies survive adverse perinatal conditions, and therefore we do not suggest a direct relationship between perinatal adversity and eventual suicide. It would seem plausible, however, that whatever environmental conditions such as family stresses, economic pressures or adolescent turmoil might precipitate suicide, those individuals whose early life experience include adverse perinatal conditions are more vulnerable to suicide during adolescence. In recent years, neonatal intensive care has saved many infants who formerly would have died from respiratory distress, but a substantial proportion of adolescent suicide victims who are survivors of neonatal respiratory distress suggests that resuscitation may contribute in ways not yet understood to early death by suicide. Although the mechanisms are not yet understood, the identification of previously unknown suicide risk factors offers opportunities for prevention. Further studies of infant and maternal factors which combine with subsequent life events to compound the risk of adolescent suicide seem warranted. That article was reviewed in Science News, and I might just read out this article by Greenberg. He says that these are not direct causes of suicide, researchers stress, but they do appear to contribute to later predisposition to suicide. We've no way of knowing what mechanisms are at work, but we can speculate, Salk says. The lack of prenatal care could suggest an unwanted pregnancy, he says, an attitude that can carry on through life. Both maternal illness and infant respiratory problems could render a child less able, physically and psychologically, to adjust to the family and environmental pressures of adolescence. Lipset, who previously linked such apparently minor birth-related risks to sudden infant death syndrome, says, the suicide study results are another indication that children who start off life in jeopardy behave differently. In turn, people, including their parents, may act differently toward them. This reciprocating spiral of interaction, he says, can conceivably contribute to later problems, including suicide. This belief is shared by Dr. Berman, Professor of Psychology at Washington, D.C., who said early trauma may change the relationship between parent and child. The study results, however, promise that some suicides might be preventable by allowing clinicians to spot the early warning signs in the youngster's birth record. At the same time, however, the findings offer another chilling possibility. We tend, and this is not an ethical judgment, not to favour the weak, Salk says. It might be, he speculates, but there's a strange set of natural checks and balances at work. Children who previously would have died at birth are now being rescued and allowed to live. Maybe nature, Salk says, meant it not to be this way. Lipset emphasises it's important to realise that most children at risk do not go on to commit suicide. He adds, however, that one could say we've gone beyond nature with our technology in saving some infants who would not have been saved. And it behoves us to look at the developmental consequences of that technology. So what are the implications of that paper? I was actually talking to some child health nurses yesterday and discussing this, and I said maybe it's an opportunity for you to be involved, and that when you get your information from the maternity hospital about the traumatic birth or whatever, you can follow the child up through to preschool, and then when you hand over to the community nurse in the school, you can explain that this child is not at risk because of that worry there that you're going to label the child, but you can say this child is going to benefit from some TLC. Well, unfortunately, I discovered that the child health nurses, when the child reaches school age, tear up their infant health records. So there's no continuity of care as far as they're concerned. But I'm sure some letter of support for the idea that there is that continuity of care from an influential place such as this would have an influence. So that's maybe something we should think about. And as far as trying to work out why, I'm reminded of the fact that when I worked here, on the long list of problems that we used to put on the neonates, I don't know if it still uses the same sort of weed system of problem-orientated records and so on, but at the bottom of the list generally, I'd say 21 would be emotional deprivation. Because at that time when I was working here, martial class was all the rage and bonding, and we were very alert to that sort of thing, so hopefully that sort of side of things was taken care of, and is still taken care of, ensuring that bonding occurs. So how are we going to prevent teenage suicide from birth? well, in fact, before birth. And you're no doubt aware there are a number of warning signs of a potentially abusive parent, and probably the same scenario is the setup for eventual abuse, eventual suicide. I'm not going to go through all that list because I know you have your own based on one from New Zealand, but obviously it's a factor worth thinking about. But again, here is a mother and father potentially abusive who need that extra support from the community. So we might help prevent it that way. So when we talk about primary prevention, what I mean is preventing a young person becoming at risk in the first place. Now, you won't read that in the literature. When they talk about primary prevention in the journals and so on, they generally talk about identifying at-risk young people, but I prefer to talk about preventing them becoming at risk in the first place. And if we're going to do that, we need to ensure that procreation is an informed choice. And I was talking to a teenage mum the other day. She said every time she went to school, every day they said, "Have you done it yet?" Well, of course she did, eventually, and had a child. So we need to try and avoid that sort of situation, and we can do that with quite a good health education syllabus that we've got here. But it needs to be available for every student. So that's one of our calls, that it should be mandatory. And incidentally, this page is taken from a letter we wrote to Mr. Dowding in February before he went into office to say that this should be a priority for his government. No one minister can be responsible for it because the causes of teenage suicide are multifactorial and it needs a multidisciplinary approach to the problem. Nevertheless, it was handed to one minister. I'm not going to go through all those, but it was just to indicate that there's so many different things we should be doing, like preventing child abuse and possibly monitoring at-risk children, or preferably calling them those that would benefit from extra TLC and various other things. There's another page of those which won't take too long to go into detail with. So I hope there'll be some time for discussion. So secondary prevention is identifying young people at risk, which, as I said, means teaching all those in contact with young people as to warning signs, which I'm not going to discuss now, although of course you do see those at risk in the antenatal clinic, and I thought you might be interested to see. In fact, some of the warning signs for potential suicide are also the same warning signs for early sexual activity in young female adolescents, and the ones that are asterisks are just the same as some of the warning signs for potential suicide. So by identifying a young person at risk, you're not only identifying someone at risk of suicide, you're also identifying someone at risk of early sexual activity and therefore maybe carcinoma of the cervix and getting HIV and of course getting pregnant. So it's an opportunity to identify young people that really would benefit from some extra counselling. And in the recent report on AIDS, they say the best way of educating about the risks of AIDS is one-to-one counselling, rather than trying to do everybody. The majority of people may maybe not at risk, but these young people are. And we saw that in the Nobody's Children programme, that they're at considerable risk of AIDS. And of course, I'll just quote this reference from Are You My Sister, Mummy, which is written by Dr. Dinah Birch in London, and I presume and hope that this is in your library here. And in that she said that suicide attempts are 4 to 5 times higher in pregnant teenagers than non-pregnant. And then after pregnancy they're also at risk. Young mothers are more likely to suffer from postnatal depression than older women. For every woman aged 25 to 29 years who is depressed after giving birth, there are 6 women aged 20 to 24 and 9 girls under 16. In America, 12% of schoolgirls show signs of postnatal depression, but even after this somewhat labile or immediate postnatal period, younger mothers continue to be prone to depression. And the degree of depression, or the incidence of it, is indicated by this sort of pie chart showing that most feel low and unhappy at times. And remember, this is school girl mothers. 1 in 3 are very unhappy, of which 1/3 are medically depressed and 1/3 attempt suicide. And one other interesting fact is that suicide is supposed to, or marriage is supposed to help prevent suicide as far as the older age group is concerned, but not so with younger people. The suicide rate is higher amongst teenage marriages, and the theory being that marriage is seen as an escape from the stress that they're in, and they end up going into a worse situation than they were in the first place. I can't see now. I better leave it on because I'll be able to use that really. I'd like to leave you with some questions. I remember when I worked here, you tend to forget that what's going on in the outside world when you're busy trying to get blood gases right and all that sort of thing. And that when you're working in a centre of excellence, you tend to forget the world out there is far from excellent. So the questions I want to put to you and leave with you are, is all your hard work and investment in the survival of premature and sick neonates like putting money into Rothwell's? Does your responsibility end when a baby leaves this building, or should you not ensure there's a continuity of care, not only medically but psychosocially? Isn't it in your own and your patient's interest to help ensure that the world is more of a nurturing environment than a present? And how can you do that? Well, you can join others who are fighting the same battle, and certainly representatives from this highly regarded institution will have great impact. So institutions such as the Green Party, turning green is becoming respectable. You can join the Family Foundation, it's fighting to support the family, and the recently convened West Australian branch of NAPCAN, the National Association of Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. And you can join my association, the Australian Association of Adolescent Health, and I have some membership forms here. I'll thank you for your attention.
Questions and discussion. I'm sure there will be some of those deliberately provocative remarks at the end. Fred, of course, I knew you'd... one and only question.
You worked very well and very hard in my department. It's really nice to see you. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you.
You've made some very good suggestions. Well, you've worked here, and since you worked here, the social work department has certainly been upgraded a lot. I think doesn't really matter. But they still probably have a long way to go in staff numbers to do the sorts of things that you, I think, have suggested. But you haven't actually suggested what we should do. So I'm going to ask you, what do you suggest we should do? How do you suggest we go about preventing suicide from the neonatal period?
Well, I think, I guess indirectly I was sort of suggesting there that we should identify parents that are going to produce children at risk. That's one thing. You're liable to identify them during the antenatal period. And I guess, and then as I say, there will be some neonates at risk from that evidence. And of course, when they actually become abusive parents, we should be able to identify those. But I guess the difficulty is getting that information, that knowledge, to those out in the community who may be able to support the family. And of course, then we have problems with confidentiality and all that sort of thing. And I guess that's why I was talking to child health nurses to say, well, look, if you did get this information, say from King Edward, could it be used to ensure that you do monitor the family and make sure they're getting the supports they need? So I guess it's a case of communication. It doesn't have to be in writing, but maybe just a phone call to say, hey, look, this mum's coming home today. We're just a bit concerned about the way she's handling the baby. I mean, maybe that happens, I don't know. But I guess the other question is, when do you stop? Communications are here that you should carry on until they're teenagers, rather than follow up for, 2 years if you have a sick neonate?
Well, I mean, I think it's a wonderful plan, but it's the implementation
Yes,
getting any support?
well, yes, because this report is really secondary prevention. It really doesn't look that much at primary prevention. It does talk about asking the Office of the Family to run parent education programs. That's about it as far as primary prevention is concerned. The rest of it is all identification of those that are already at risk and improving services to cope with the demand, because already they can't cope with the number of kids that are coming into casualty with overdoses. So this report is to improve that situation. It's not looking at preventing it so much in the first place. And I guess that's the next stage. And that's something we hope to do with the Australian Association for Medicine Health wants to do at our conference next year, which is looking at that whole global issue and trying to link it all together so that we're not going off here, there and everywhere dealing with homelessness one minute, substance abuse the next, that we try and look at it in a sensible way. But coming back to your original question, what do we actually do? And as I say, you say you do follow these families up and so on. Well, I think there are resources out there which tend to be underutilised. As I said, when I worked here, I had no idea that my position existed, or that there was a child health services centre, and there are 4 of those now in Queen's Park, Southwell, Kandula and Lockridge. All have social workers, some have clinical psychologists and speech pathologists, and we see a lot of these kids through the fact that they present with speech language delay, secondary to underlying psychosocial problems. So there are resources out there, but we don't get to hear what's going on in the hospitals. It's a case of communication, getting the follow-up through to these community agencies which do exist.
Ollie?
Can I just ask if there are a centre out there that does provide education courses for parents?
Yes, there are various agencies that do that.
Besides Parent Health Centre?
I was going to say Parent Health Centre.
Besides that one, because that really is sincere.
Yes, that's right.
Because a lot of families want that. But
Mm.
when they come along, I've had people that come to all 10 of our talks and really want something in the community.
No, I think DCS run programs would be the majority. I think Family Foundation are trying to get some of these things going. They're trying to do parent education in the schools, and as I say, it's supposed to be in their syllabus anyway. And actually, one of the suggestions that was made, which wasn't taken up, was a test driver baby scheme, a bit like work experience. So that instead of work experience, the student goes into a family's home and has to do the nappies and the washing, the bathing. They get real hands-on experience, which normally they would have got if they lived in an extended family. But they don't have that now. They don't have that experience, and because their first experience is when the baby's born, and it's a shock. Sometimes they never get over. But as far as I know, there aren't that many parent education programs going. But say a centre like ours, the local child health nurse is doing it herself. It's really a local initiative that you may have some in some centres and not in others. I'm sure there's some around, but
Perhaps one of
there need to be more.
The spin-off from the high interest rates may be the recreation of the extended family. Somebody said no.
Thanks, Greg. That was an interesting talk. I haven't regarded suicide as a side effect of our long-term follow-up program. Following one of them, it's really something that has to be finished, I think. But certainly, the Hottenberg issues you discussed, child abuse in parents, learning disabilities are something very common in our high-risk population. We only follow it in high school. Another feature that perhaps I don't think is stressed as much as I might have is that many of those problems, I don't know about suicide, but certainly children suffering from emotional and environmental deprivation and later major learning disabilities become very selectively from a group of the population that are very poor to take up health resources when you try and encourage them. They're not the people that are asking for lectures. Those people that want to go on to lectures on the aircraft are people that don't need it. The rooms that you really want to get into are the ones that we try and we from our end are not very good at how to communicate with the community. Should be, but all the community are trying to get the child autistic, are trying to get them to come, and then they're going to enable it at their time. How to change that attitudinal problem of perceiving that they have a need when they feel they don't, we feel they do, I think is a crux.
Yeah, I agree entirely, Noel. And as you say, I should have stressed that. In fact, that was one of the concerns we had at the centre of our work out at Queen's Park, that we're not seeing the families that really need the assistance. And so what we dreamed up was a volunteer program based on a scheme in Brisbane which was for preventing child abuse. And it's called the Parent Aid Unit, but we weren't going to advertise it as preventing child abuse. We just want to advertise it as supporting families. And the idea is that we employ a coordinator who trains the volunteers in association with the people that work at our centre. And these volunteers would then be linked to families that just need that bit of extra support. And when we've discussed the idea, we've seen clients and said, you know, how would it be if a volunteer came in, someone just down the road there, came in, just give you a couple of hours so you can go out shopping. Oh, it'd be wonderful, because they just don't have those supports around. So we thought this would be very relevant for the Family Support Foundation to fund. No way, not interested. So we tried again, and incidentally this was an interdepartmental group that was working on this one. It was representatives from local government, Department of Community Services, Education Department and Health, and a non-government agency. Because that's what we've got to do, is work together on these sort of issues. So we all got together and formulated another submission, and this time we went to the Minister for Community Services. We thought the Minister for Family was most appropriate, but weren't interested. So we went to the Minister for Community Services. First thing he did was look through the submission, found the funding. See, the problem with this is, if it works, all the other suburbs want to do the same thing. We haven't had a no as yet, but he wasn't enthusiastic at all. I've gone off here. So, yeah, just answering your question, Noel, that was the idea, that we'd use people that are actually out there in the community, maybe just living down the road, who are not a threat. They can go into the family, empower them to come to our place, come to outpatient departments and whatever, to get that support. Because they can't even get beyond first base, as you were saying. That the idea of going to see a doctor or a nurse or whatever is just a total anathema to some of the clients that we have around our area.
Do you know any information of schemes to keep your granny? That like subsidised housing, that you can get a special rate if you have a house in incorporated grandparents, which might seem pretty complicated.
Yeah, I don't know about within the housing situation, but there's certainly a linked grandparent scheme, which is supposed to be run by a Bureau for the Aged, and you can apply for a grant if you want to try and set that up. I'm not sure how far it is going, but I haven't heard that it's off the ground as yet, but certainly schemes like that have been found to be of great benefit. There is a Dial a Granny scheme over in Sydney, and there's a similar scheme in England, I believe. I forgot what that one's called. But yeah, I guess it gets back to the surrogate clan idea. Bring back the clan, the supportive network, and as I say, maybe the side effect of the housing crisis will be we'll have to get people living together in condominiums. And we've got the technology to ensure that neighbours get on with neighbours. We can have a sort of neighbour match, computer match system. We just have to use our imagination to overcome some of these major fundamental social problems that reflect on our kids.
What about the idea of the private sector assisting in funding some of these programs? What we look at government funding, and we all know it's not a bottomless pit. I mean, there's only so many taxpayer dollars that go into welfare schemes. I mean, maybe it's time to look further into that, the private corporate sector to look at trying to move into some of these areas. And as you say, there have been a few schemes that have gone out into private areas and have been very successful. The intergenerational program, certainly, the last seniors week we had, we could do it for 1 week of the year, and we had a seniors week. But surely, we need to look at extending that beyond. To hear that the Family Foundation can support it, maybe, okay, maybe there isn't the money and everybody would sort of look for similar programs, but maybe it's time that we started to really get, what the other companies have got, service clubs and church groups and the like. I mean, there is money out there. It's a matter of tapping into it in the right way.
Yeah, I agree entirely, and I guess that was Plan E. We thought we'd go for government first. If that doesn't work, then we can go opposition. There's a sort of range of options, and I think that should be the last resort, because there is a department which should be concerned about that, and that was one of the objections to our scheme. Was well, hey, look, we're doing this sort of thing ourselves. I mean, it would rather suggest that we're not succeeding. And I didn't say yes, obviously, but I think government should take on this major issue first off. I'm sure if that doesn't work, if they won't, that is an option. Corporate sponsorship.
What are your feelings on the level of sex education, or should I say sexuality education in schools? I mean, do you feel comfortable with the acceptability of that? My understanding is that it depends very much on the principle of the school, whether it's accepted or not. And if it is accepted, it's sometimes handed on to someone that concerns me that they possibly aren't present to be teaching it, and they don't feel comfortable themselves. So I was just, is this still the same situation? Is this still very much the K10 syllabus is left with the principle?
Yeah, when we first lobbied for mandatory health education, that was over a year ago now. They'd done a study to find out how many schools were actually doing the K-10 syllabus, and our prompting made them want to do another survey, and they compared the two, and quite a considerable number of schools had dropped over a period of time. I think 57% of schools are doing health ed, and obviously they're looking at this, and it is a recommendation in this report that it should be mandatory. But as you say, is it being taught properly anyway? And that is another recommendation, that there needs to be proper in-servicing of those that do that very crucial teaching. But at the moment it tends to get left to the phys ed teacher, because phys ed, you've got to be healthy, therefore they should teach health ed.
If I can just add to that, Professor Mike Conn, who's not here, and I actually approached the Minister for Health. We went and saw her about this as a college initiative, because the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists is concerned about this and felt that each state should be doing, or the college should be doing more about seeing that health ed in its widest meaning was made mandatory. The Minister Carmen Lawrence is very sympathetic and is keen, in fact, to see that that does eventuate. But of course, there's a whole lot of pressures on teachers and on schools to teach this, that, and everything else. And we said, well, we felt this was probably more important than trigonometry and all the other maths and other stuff that lots of kids learn and don't find any use for or value in. But as Brett says, there's a great dearth of teachers, and much still depends on whether the headmaster feels as though it's a good idea or not. Usually it's the subject they drop first. Most years 9 to, I've forgotten all the years now, but years 1 to 3 do it, but then it drops off very rapidly, of course, after that. And much depends on the headmaster, the teachers. There's more in the metropolitan schools than in the country schools who come up very badly, and it's often left to the phys ed teacher or the health sister in school. Phil?
I grew up in an age where children were seen and not heard. I find it very difficult to sympathise with the philosophy of the young people today. They are the forgotten generation. Everything, repeat, everything is geared to the needs of and catered for the needs of young people. In my day, of course, everybody starts to find it very tedious to listen to this sort of thing, but in my day we broke the rules at home or at school. We knew that we were going to get the cane, we got the cane. Today, if a teacher dares to punish a child for some misdemeanour at school, the mother immediately, of course, writes to the local member of parliament. All this sort of thing. I think that the whole thing, when you get down to the nitty-gritty of the whole thing, it depends entirely. It goes back, like lots of other things, goes back to parent example and the home environment. Now, how you're going to do anything about that, God only knows. But until you can do something about that, I think that, you're putting the cart before the horse, and you'll never get anywhere with teenage suicide.
Right, yeah, I tend to agree that I think I've indicated all along, primary prevention is crucial, otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. We need to go back to supporting families and role modelling and all that sort of thing. We're going to perhaps go back to this scenario, and that's what we hope to do at next year's conference, to see how we can in fact tie up all these factors to not only say if we tackle the greenhouse effect, for example. If we were to ban the motor vehicle, that would have a tremendous benefit for the greenhouse effect. It would also have a tremendous benefit for society. The pace of life would actually have to slow down, which is described in this catalyst change document. We wouldn't be able to get around so much, there wouldn't be so much mobility, we'd start putting down roots. And I wouldn't be able to do what I did. I'm one of those babies, born with a silver spoon in the mouth. I was born in 1947 and moved to Australia, so I moved away from my support networks, I moved away from my family, and everything's fine until you end up having kids. And then everything's fine when the kids are healthy and well. But when they get sick, you haven't got anyone else around to help, things break down. And I think, if we can start rebuilding roots, and maybe an outcome of the problems with, the dream home is no longer reality, maybe by living together in a supportive environment, we can perhaps bring back some of these sort of extended family ideas, a surrogate extended family. It doesn't necessarily have to be your own family, but at least a local older person can support a single parent who lives in the same sort of condominium. We've got to sort of think third wave solutions to third wave problems, and that relates to Arvin Toffler's book, The Third Wave. Because what we're tending to do, we're dealing with third wave problems with second wave solutions, and that's why it's not working. So I agree with you that that's what we need, but, and it's not going to be easy to get back to that situation. But that's what we have to look at next year at this conference, and get experts from all over Australia to look at the global perspective and see how we can link some of these things together.
One more question.
I just mentioned that recently about child health registration, and Joan didn't attend to go to one of the lectures, and she in fact is establishing the course of courtesy called entrance, which is for professional health workers and for recognising and relating with families where child abuse situation occurs. She's actually the first person in Australia to do that sort of.
Well, Brett, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking and stimulating talk. I think it's going to get a lot more of us thinking about the problem. And we'd like to hear also more about the international conference on adolescent health, which we're having here next year. Maybe we can involve. Thank you very much.